Avner Gvayahu, thank you so much for joining us. Take us back to that moment when you felt that you had to confront what you were doing. The moment that you occupied a Palestinian house. What was that moment for you?
So I grew up in a society and in an environment that educated me, pushed me to take responsibility. And I remember one of the teachings of a rabbi, a teacher I had, that told me, a good Jew walks around with question marks around his head. And I think that also as a soldier I had those question marks, but I found ways to rationalize things around me.
But when you walked into this house and you had to occupy a family and a home, you started asking these questions.
So I asked these questions, but it wasn't, I would say, till one of the moments during the end of my service did these questions really manage to pop out. And it was this specific house that I served in Nablus. So taking over this individual's house, obviously you don't need a warrant if you're a military occupying force, and we barge into the house, arrest the head of the family, handcuff, blindfold him, and take him, his wife, and his daughter and put them in a room. And for me at that moment, these question marks, the lights over my head started turning on, and I went into the room where we put this family and sat and had a conversation with this Palestinian. And what I thought was sort of me being humane or moral towards him, I found to be flipped. Even though I was the one with the power, he was generous and kind enough to explain to me what his life is like.
Did you start to confront what you were doing as a soldier?
I would say that there was a process, but that was the moment that I couldn't ignore it anymore.
Your group is breaking the silence. Did you feel as if you were complicit in the silence, if being a good Israeli soldier meant that you did not ask these questions?
I was complicit. I was complicit not only in silence but in violent actions. I myself was violent, and I was silent about my own violence. And I think that the men and women who comprise Breaking the Silence feel very much that we are trying to take responsibility for our own actions. In that sense, because we were all former soldiers serving in the IDF, about a third of our members are officers as well, our act of speaking out is us taking responsibility.
Is there, you've spoken to a lot of people and they give their testimony anonymously. Is there a commonality to the stories that they tell you? Stories that line up with your own experience?
So first I would say, we obviously don't meet them anonymously. They don't just send in a testimony or phone in and leave us a voicemail. We sit down with each and every one.
But you don't divulge their identities, obviously.
Right, of our testifiers. And we offer those who would wish it to also speak publicly. You know, some of the testimonies could be more violent actions, humiliations of Palestinians, theft, destruction of property. I would say the majority of the testimonies are really the mundane, day-to-day reality. And that's what I would say is a big part of what we're trying to expose. Because it's very clear that when you see or hear of a case of someone slapping a Palestinian or stealing from a Palestinian house, that is bad, right? And the army itself will not ask soldiers or command soldiers to do that, but that's still part of a military occupation. But what each and every soldier does is maintain control over the Palestinian population.
Are you talking here about a deep corruption and a violence within the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, or is this a product of occupation? Where is the emphasis?
So I'll give you an example. We were founded with a group of soldiers who served in Hebron, one of the largest Palestinian cities in the West Bank, and the only Palestinian city where in the heart of it you'll find an Israeli settlement. So about 750 Israeli settlers guarded by about 650 Israeli soldiers. And the main street of this city, since the mid-90s, but definitely after the Second Intifada in September 2000, has been what soldiers called sterilized, meaning Palestinians living on that street are not allowed to walk on it, while I can walk on it as an Israeli, internationals are allowed to walk on it. That is something that was ordered from up high. That's a structural decision, a governmental decision. And part of the things we try to ask and try to raise and try to put a light on, someone not being allowed to leave his house and our society accepting that, is that not part of our moral corruption?
So your issue is not with the Israeli Defence Force per se, perhaps to an extent it is, but it is much more about occupation. You are opposed to occupation.
I would agree with that. It's not at all about the individual soldier, and it's much more about the structure, which obviously high-ranking generals help orchestrate, but they are given their orders by the Israeli government, and the Israeli government is elected by the people. So in that sense, when what we're trying to do is not fix the occupation from within, but end the structure.
The critics of what you're doing and breaking the silence say there is no silence to break. There is no secrecy here, and you would have the capacity to have raised these things through the correct channels within Israel, within the Defence Force. Is that not the case, that you could raise these issues and have a hearing?
We don't believe so. We think there's a...
But there are mechanisms, aren't there, to take up just these types of cases. If you believe abuses are being carried out, there are mechanisms within the military and elsewhere to pursue them.
So there's a phrase or a saying in Hebrew that some people on the left use talking about hakibush mashchit. Occupation corrupts. It's not that soldiers come in corrupted already. There's a process of corruption. And I think that because we've been at this for 51 years, and there's unbelievable political pressure to maintain this reality on the ground, to keep the status quo, we have also carried in mechanisms that could be used, actually allowed to permeate the situation. It's very clear from cases brought to justice in claims of Palestinians from settlement violence or settler violence, even military violence. The amount of cases that actually find their way to justice are minimal, right? The system itself, in that sense...
doesn't give you the opportunity to be able to raise it.
Yeah,
is that what you're saying?
But I would add one thing. I think in that sense, what we're trying to do is not fix the system from within, because the problem, again, is not the soldier, right? Where, in that sense, we ourselves were former soldiers, right? There are people that are now serving that will give us testimonies. The problem is the system of occupation, and that will corrupt not only the military's actions, but the state itself.
Now, again, critics say what you are doing here is feeding the narrative of Israel's critics, that Israel itself is in a situation where it is facing hostility from without and hostility from within as well. And that we know that there are rocket attacks, particularly from Gaza. We saw the recent protests and how bloody that all turned. That Israel is defending itself and ensuring its own security, and what you are doing is feeding the critics of Israel. How do you respond to that?
So I'll start by saying, I love my country. I was willing, and I joined the army willing to die and kill for it, and I am still willing to do that at this point. But I am not willing to kill and die for a military occupation. And I think that what some of the critics of breaking the silence do is equate Israel with occupation, saying if you want to support Israel, you have to support this occupation. What breaking the silence does, like many others around the Israeli society and elsewhere, we're saying Israel and the occupation are not the same. The area in Gaza, I think we can call today Area G. It's true, you don't have settlements or military soldiers inside the Strip, but Israel, without a doubt, still controls the Strip, right? This former high-ranking officers, former ministers of defense have said this publicly. Israel still controls the aspects of going in, of going out of the Strip. The registry in the Strip, every Gazan born today is registered with Israel, Israeli military. The currency there is Israeli shekels.
So there is still that presence of Israel.
There still is a presence from the surrounding. Now, I would add, definitely there's Egyptian responsibility, there's a border there, but we have more responsibility and more agency. And I would add, as an Israeli, I see the actions of Hamas, which I refer to as a terrorist organization, or Islamic Jihad, as shooting missiles on Israeli civilians, as an act of terrorism, and I condemn it. But the vast majority of Palestinians living under Israeli occupation, the West Bank and Gaza, are not Hamas members. And in the Gaza Strip, over 50% of the people living there are under 18. So they didn't even vote for Hamas. So I'm an Israeli, right? And the Israeli government is my representative government, and they're the ones that I pay taxes to. So what I can look at when I grew up in Israel in the mid-90s, the peace peace solutions were always around the corner, and therefore we were ignoring the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is the expansion of settlement building, settler violence, destruction of Palestinian communities, mostly in Area C, limit movement for Palestinians. Basically, we're entrenching ourselves in this reality. And as an Israeli who believes that we have to move forward, and we can move forward, I am petrified in where we're going. So I think there's responsibility to go around, but as the strongest power in this game, and definitely those who are setting the rules, right? The occupation is built not by Palestinians for Palestinians, or not by the people for the people, but by Israel for Israel, then I call and demand, first and foremost, my government, but I also call upon those who believe in Israel, right, and want to see an Israel that will flourish, to support an end to the Israeli occupation. And those things, for me, live together. Being pro-Israel, in my book, means opposing the occupation.